The second session for today. So this session is going to be mostly about biodiversity. And so we have three speakers. Notice that there will be a change compared to the program. So Katheline will start and will introduce you to the insurance role that biodiversity can play. Then Tatiana Visek, who's online, will discuss animal welfare and the implications that it has on basically the decision making if we introduce animal welfare in some ways into the discussion. And last, Lucy Zinger was supposed to introduce some concepts of biodiversity, from the standpoint of a biologist. Unfortunately, she cannot be there, and so Irene Roux accepted to replace her at the very last moment, so this morning. And she will discuss different ways in which biodiversity can be used and the consequences that it may have on human populations. So we'll start with Katheline, who's professor at the Paris School of Economics and in Paris 1, and who's also a member of the High Council for Climate. So Katheline, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's working? Yeah. Thanks a lot. Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about biodiversity on the perspective of an economist. Okay, so I warn you. I think for economists, studying biodiversity is something extremely difficult, very much more difficult to study than climate, for instance. Because for climate, there are emissions. They cause temperature increase. The mechanism is not simple, but there is a very well identified mechanism. Whereas biodiversity is something much more diverse, very difficult to define, to handle. And so for economists, knowing how to, by which angle looking at it, it's really very difficult. Okay, so there are a lot of applied works in economics about biodiversity, trying to see what is the value of biodiversity in different circumstances. There are also some policy works, what can we do? But in the end, in the theoretical sphere, there is not much in economics. Okay, so this attempt that I'm going to present here is very modest because it is just a very narrow angle that I'm going to adopt. But okay, it's an attempt to say something from an economic point of view about biodiversity. So, as I said, biodiversity is something really diverse. It represents at the same time the variety of life, including variations among genes, species, functional traits. And it provides a very wide range of services, ecosystem services. We are used to distinguish between three types of services, mainly provisioning services, like production of renewable resources, food, wood, water. Regulating services, that are processes that lessen environmental change, like climate regulation, flood control, biocontrol, soil fertility, and so on. This is provided by nature, by biodiversity. And also it provides cultural services from another point of view. So this is really very diverse. The projection by the FAO, to just give one example, they say that agricultural production is expected to increase by 70% between 25 and 2050. And that is going to be done to feed the population that is expected to reach more than 9 billion people by 2050. And so clearly, to satisfy the needs of this growing population and to... Je change? Ok. J'enlève celui-là? Non. To satisfy the need of this growing population and to produce this, to feed these people, we are going to need to increase the space, the land that is devoted to agriculture. So this is land use change. And land use change is very useful, of course, because we need to produce food. But also land use change is more and more questions because it comes at the expense of biodiversity. Okay? So the IPBES gives very clear information on that. I have just put here, probably you don't see anything, but I have just put here a table from the last assessment from the IPBES, the Global Assessment on Biodiversity. You will see the problems, the different issues that are posed. But yeah, and in this one maybe it's more clear because it's bigger. You see here that land use change is one of the big causes of biodiversity destruction. Okay? This is the perspective we are going to take. So, ecosystem services, they are often very costly to replace by human-made actions, or even often impossible to replace. So biodiversity, because it is very, very difficult to replace, has a value. From the economist's perspective, it has a value. It is a non-market value because there is no market for that. There is no market price. And it is very important to try to understand the drivers of this value. What causes the value of biodiversity and of ecosystem services? So the way economists have done until now is to do that from an empirical angle, mostly applied work, trying to estimate the value of ecosystem services. For instance, if you lose the service of pollination by bees, how much are you going to pay to replace for that? Okay, and et cetera, for different services, provided that they can be replaced. Or if they cannot be replaced, how much damage is their disappearance going to cause? So this is applied work. This is very interesting. Usually you find enormous figures for these values, but it is very, it is non-conceptual. You have very different studies that find different figures. It's very difficult to assess. So here, what we want to do is not to go into this applied literature, but to try to do something more theoretical. And so the angle we adopt, as I said, is narrow. We want to look at the value of biodiversity from the perspective of its insurance components. Okay? And so the idea is that conserving natural biodiversity is an insurance against the fluctuations of agricultural productivity in our framework. Okay, it's something that smoothes the fluctuation of agricultural productivity because all of the provisioning services that are provided by biodiversity. To give you an illustration before going more into the details, there is this paper by Noack and co-authors. It's an applied paper. He looks at a panel of a lot of households in 23 developing countries. He combines that with data on drought, and which is the major reason for crop losses in developing countries. He combines that also with data on natural biodiversity and data on the timing of agricultural cycle. Okay. And what they find is that the volatility of agricultural yields comes from weather events. The increasing volatility comes from weather events, for sure. Drought, for instance. But also, they find, and this is the important thing for us, they find that the negative impact of drought on crop declines when natural biodiversity increases, meaning that natural biodiversity dampens the negative impact of weather events. Okay, and it is in this sense that keeping a good level of biodiversity is an insurance against bad outcomes in agriculture. And also they are able to measure the magnitude of the effect, and it's quite big. They find that reducing biodiversity by one standard deviation below the regional mean, almost doubles the negative impact of growth on income, on agricultural incomes. Okay? So this is based on this type of results. This is not the only paper, I just talk about this one for illustration, that we build the model we use in the papers that are presented here, that are written with Emmanuel Augereau and Giorgio Fabri. So I think I have put on my slide too many details about the model, so I'm not going to look at that in detail, but explain the story, what we do. So what we do a model of land conversion, where converting more land to farming allows to produce more food. So this is the clear effect, but it is at the expense of biodiversity, because you have less land for forests, for instance, that shelter biodiversity. And there is a negative feedback effect of biodiversity destruction on the variability of agricultural productivity by the mechanism I have just explained. And so there is a trade-off between food production and biodiversity conservation. In this model, it is kept very, very simple so that we can say something on a theoretical point of view. So we do not introduce, of course, many elements like fertilizers or pesticides, stuff like that, okay? It's very simple, just agriculture production and biodiversity. And then what we look at is that we compare three situations. One where there is no biodiversity anymore. All the land is converted to agriculture. And so variability of the productivity is maximum. Another situation where there is a regulator, a planner, let's say, that chooses how much land to convert to farming and how much to keep for biodiversity conservation. And one intermediate situation where there are farmers that make individual choices about how much of their plot they are going to convert to farming and how much they keep for biodiversity conservation. So we compare these three situations, and this is what allows us to estimate the insurance value of biodiversity, because of course all these agents, the planner or the farmers, they have a utility function, they have a welfare that they derive for agriculture, agricultural activity, and we see how this welfare is impacted by biodiversity destruction. And this gives us the value that in this economy they give to biodiversity conservation. That's it. That's the story. So there is say a word about literature. There is a small literature on economics, on the insurance value of biodiversity, but it's very small. There is more literature in biology. So in biology, the stabilizing role of biodiversity is very well documented. I cite here a paper by Laureau and Mazancourt, but there are others. Also here in biology, there are papers, for example, this one that explain very clearly that biodiversity has a role of spatial insurance in heterogeneous landscapes. For instance, landscape where you have forests, very biodiversity rich, and crops and fields, poor from the biodiversity point of view. And so they explain that very well. In economics, we have a literature on the role of common pool resources, such as natural forests, as an insurance device for poor rural people. This is well documented. I have cited some examples here. And also, what is important also is the context where these people do not have access to formal insurance. Okay, so we can compare the role of natural insurance provided by biodiversity to the role of a formal insurance, credit markets, and so on, that would be provided by the economy, let's say. So this model is quite simple. We have a stock of land. The farmers or the regulator has to decide which part to devote to farming, which part to keep for biodiversity. Very, very simple. The ecological part of the model is a part where we specify the relationship between space and biodiversity. 5 minutes. Okay, I accelerate. So it's a well-known species area curve. The more space, the more biodiversity. And then agricultural production is just a function of space and productivity. Okay, and productivity is affected by has a natural has a trend of an increase, and also is affected by shocks, weather shocks. This is natural variability, and this may be dampened, as I said, by the size of land that is devoted to biodiversity conservation, which allows to reduce this volatility. Okay. Then the important part also is the utility function. We look at the determinants, the preference determinants of the farmer or the planner, and there are we see that we see that there are three very important variables: their attitude towards time, discounting. Their attitude towards risk, how much they are averse to these fluctuations of productivity, how much they are risk averse, and also their attitude towards time in the sense that how are they averse to fluctuations of their income over time. We disentangle the three determinants of the preferences, and then taking that into account, we are able to compute the optimal share of land devoted to farming or to biodiversity conservation, and also the share of land that would be chosen by farmers in a decentralized setup. Okay? And what we find is that, of course, farmers, they convert more land to farming that would be optimal. And the idea is that the reason why it occurs is that because there is in this model an externality, a volatility externality. The farmers, they do not take into account the fact that when they decide to convert land to farming, this is going to have an effect on other farmers' outcome through the decrease of biodiversity they provoke. Okay? And so we measure these effects, and we see to which extent it is important to correct it to have the closest, the more optimal conversion to farming is possible. Okay, so I have 1 more minute.
Oh, sure, yeah,
2?
3, 4.
3. Okay, so we do that. I just give you an idea of the result. We show that the conversion rates of land to farming increases with the discount rate. More impatient society converts more, decreases more the forest. We show that it decreases with volatility, so with risk, and also with the perception of risk aversion. And we show that the aversion to fluctuation, on the contrary, has an ambiguous role. It has not the same role in economies that have a good technical progress in agriculture, a good trend of agricultural productivity, and in economies that have bad prospects for their agricultural productivity trend. Okay. So we find that. We find also that we find also what are the determinants of the volatility externality that I have mentioned. We find that it does not depend on risk aversion. It decreases with aversion to fluctuation, and also it increases with the number of farmers, meaning in fact that an increase in population is bad for. It's not quite surprising a result, I should say, but we find that. The result is a bit more subtle, so I have explained here on the slide that the result is a bit more subtle, but have not time to go into the details. And to finish, just last word, we compute the value of biodiversity. What is it for us? It is the welfare gain in this economy from switching to a situation where there is no biodiversity at all to a situation where there is optimal biodiversity, or where there is the biodiversity chosen by the farmers. We compute it, we show very easily the expression it has. We look at what are the determinants of this value, and again we study that. And I think the interesting result is that in the end of these papers we try to calibrate that. We try to calibrate that to a poor agricultural economy, to have a flavor, to have an idea of what would be the value of biodiversity in this setup. So I don't have time to go into the details of the calibration, but this is what we do. And we look at how it varies, this value, with the preference for the present, with aversion to risk, and with aversion to fluctuations, and with the number of farmers. Thank you.